Professor Brown, time to discuss Minhag. And Professor Benny Brown from the Hebrew University. I don't think I have to introduce you, but anyway, this is the Minhag here. Yeah. So Benny Brown, Professor Benny Brown, in the Department of Jewish Thought at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His main focus is Orthodox Judaism, which he studies in a variety of aspects: Halakhah, Hasidut, Musar, Ashkafa, etc., etc., etc. His pirsumim, his publication is not to list it, is beyond our time. Please, Benny, take your stand and speak about Haminhagim Umekorei Hadinim, the book, its directions, and its place in the development of Halakhah and Hasidism. Please.
Thank you. Shalom, everyone. I just want to say that it's a really pleasure talking in this forum. I'd like to focus on a specific book, Haminhagim Umekorei Hadinim, which I personally bought in a bookstore, which is supposed to be quite normal, but as many of the people here probably know, it was a very common, most people I think got it as a bar mitzvah present. Yes. You too. It was a very popular bar mitzvah present, Haminhagim Umekorei Hadinim. In English it's called, by the way, Reasons for Jewish Customs and Traditions. And not only people my age, people older than me also got it, many of them as a bar mitzvah present. Often more than one copy, usually from the less generous relatives, because it was quite an inexpensive book. The fact that it became a common bar mitzvah present, and its inexpensive price, despite the fact that it is not particularly a thin book, testify that we're talking about a very popular book, perhaps even a classic. I would also argue that in its time it was to a degree innovative. Nevertheless, to the best of my knowledge, it has not received scholarly attention, and it seems to me that the time for that has come, even if in a short lecture. The first volume of Haminhagim Umekorei Hadinim was published in 1894 in Lemberg, Lviv, in Galicia. The author was Ish Shub, that's how it appeared, the pseudonym of Avram Yitzchak Sperling. Sperling was a rank-and-file Hasid of Olesk, not a rabbi, not a rebbe, who earned his living as a shochet. Throughout the years, he collected and clarified a variety of customs and eventually organized them, elucidated their sources and their rationales, and published them in a book. The first volume of the book received approbations from Yitzchak Shmelkes, the well-known rabbi of Lvov and the author of Spontas Beit Yitzchak, from Rebbe Menachem Mendel Eichenstein of Olesk, the rebbe of the author, and his father-in-law, as Wunder teaches us, and subsequently later editions from Reb Tzvi Hirsch Horowitz of Rosvadov, a Hasidic rebbe of the Ropshitz dynasty, and Reb Tzvi Cheskel Michelson, a rabbi, community leader, and who later became known as the author of Orthodox biographies and as a member of the Rabbinic Council of Warsaw. The book enjoyed surprising success and was published in 6 editions already in the lifetime of the author, including a version in Yiddish. The new editions included new volumes as well, and ultimately the book reached 4 volumes that were most often bound together. At a certain point, Sperling adopted the shortened version of the book title, calling it only Haminhagim. In the later editions of the work, Sperling argued with criticism and complained that other writers plagiarized his ideas, further testimony to the presence of the book in on the public stage. After Sperling's death, his children continued to publish the book, and others published it without permission. It remained popular even after the Holocaust and was published in English under the title mentioned above, Reasons for Jewish Customs and Traditions. Beyond the fact that the book was a commercial success, and beyond the fact that it apparently strengthened the connectedness of Orthodox Jews to customs, it seems to me that the book constitutes an historical milestone and on another plane. To the best of my knowledge, this is the first book in history on Hasidic customs. And as I will explain later on, this is a twofold historic milestone, because both in the history of Hasidism and in the history of Jewish law, Halakhah. Haminhagim never declares itself to be a book of specifically Hasidic customs. And from a numerical perspective, only a minority of the customs discussed are characteristically Hasidic, while a majority are regular Ashkenazi customs. However, the book's Hasidic nature cries out from practically every page of it. First of all, already in the book's introduction, Sperling points out that in addition to the halachic sources on which he bases himself, quote, there are in this book a number of innovative Torah insights and famous stories of tzaddikim that I took from the holy books, unquote. In later edition, this declaration appears on the title page of the book. Sperling even referred to readers who are particularly interested in these stories, referred them to the pages on which they appear in pinpointed way at the beginning of the book, provided as a list of tzaddikim, as was customary in Hasidic books of the time. In the places where the tzaddikim appear, their names are graphically emphasized, but most importantly, not only are there stories of tzaddikim in the book, but also countless number of Torah thoughts cited in the name of Hasidic rabbis on almost every page of the book. That constitute a vital source for the reasons for the ta'amim of the various customs. In other words, the reasons the ta'amim are actually Hasidic reasons that Werther by Rebbe corroborate. One who studies the entries of customs that Sperling brings is sometimes surprised by what is missing and what seems to be extraneous. Thus, for example, the adoption of Nusach Sfarad as the formulation of Hasidic prayer, which is considered from a certain perspective as a basic identifying feature of Hasidism, is not mentioned in the book, even if the author at times addresses the language of the Sfarad formulation. The Hasidic customs to put on two sets of tefillin, Rashi and Rabbeinu, is not brought explicitly, but only in the context of whoever wears Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin should do such and such. The Hasidic custom to refrain from wearing tefillin on Chol HaMoed, Pesach, on the whole, is not brought at all, perhaps because one of the most dominant Hasidic rabbis of Galicia, Rabbi David of Buchach, vociferously opposed this custom. Similarly, I didn't find an expression of the Hasidic stringencies regarding bodily cleanliness before prayer, which is the obligation to go to bathroom before standing to pray, perhaps because some of the rabbis of later Hasidism opposed the exaggerations that developed in this area within the Hasidic camp itself. On the other hand, the custom to place 12 chales on the Shabbat table, which is primarily practiced by rabbis, is brought in the book as regular custom that is incumbent to all Jews. And it is interesting to know that the Hasidic custom to delay the time of prayer is also given a justification, if only in the fourth and final volume of the book. No less interesting surprise awaits the reader in the second volume of the book, in which there are several sections that do not deal with customs in their accepted sense. For example, the author explains why certain individuals or items are called by the titles in which they are known. Umot ha'olam, Talmid Chacham, Am Haaretz, what stands behind those Rebbes, Sofrim, Geonim, Sefer, Avuka, kind of etymological analysis of these words. In these sections, for example, he explains why the holy Jewish people are accustomed to shake, when they read the Torah. And even, believe it or not, why people are accustomed to laugh when they see someone fall down. This is also a custom. Everyone laughs, so it's a custom. When they see a person falling down. Similar tendency characterizes the final section of the book, where Sperling presents supernatural cures, kulot, and folk remedies, refuot as he calls them. It should be noted that the remedies are based on consultation with the Rebbe of Stettin. It is highly doubtful that Sperling actually viewed these as customs in the full sense of the word. It is possible that he brought them as practical suggestions that could enhance the appeal of the book. Indeed, it seems that the advice suggested in the section was considered strange even in conservative circles, as it was deleted from an edition of the Haminhagim published in Pest, Hungary. It is also possible that it was deleted because it seems strange, as alluded by the grandson of the author, Moshe Sperling, in the introduction to the new Israeli edition of the book. It may also be that the publisher simply felt that despite all of the interest in these pieces of advice, it was improper to include them as customs with all the normative implications of the concept in Halachic culture and in general, and in Hungarian Orthodoxy in particular. The question is also, to what degree Sperling himself believed that this suggested Sgulot and Refuot fall within the parameters of custom. I tend to believe that he did not, but it is worthwhile to point out that an important fact. In the second volume of the book, the very volume that primarily consists of Likutim, including those Sgulot and Refuot, there is an additional section entitled Forsake not the law of thy mother, Al titosh Torat imecha. This verse is cited in the Gemara as a source for the obligation to adhere to customs, halachic duty to adhere to customs. In the entire section discusses this halachic principle. In that discussion, Sperling brings a series of sources, some of them Hasidic, that embellish the importance of observing customs, including statements of leaders of the conservative branch of Hungarian Orthodoxy who taught, primarily in opposition to the Reform movement, that questioning custom is like questioning the totality of Jewish tradition. Sperling refers to the Khatam Sofer to strengthen his claim that, quote, the first sign of blasphemy and heresy is one who changes Jewish custom, who needs to be examined. Such a person needs to be examined. And he quotes at length the words of Khatam Sofer's militant protege, Reb Hillel Lichtenstein, on this matter. The tough stance taken in this section sharpens the question I raised before. Did Sperling really see the recommendations, Gulot and Refuot, that he listed in the second volume as norms covered under the obligation of forsake not the law of thy mother? Did he really believe that someone who doesn't laugh at a person who falls down is suspect of blasphemy and heresy? As stated, it is logical to assume that the answer to this question is no, and that is an expression of the fact that Sperling's analytical capacities, Lomdish capacities, were below his skill at collecting sources. He was an ontologist, if you like. The third and fourth volumes of Tamei Haminhagim primarily fill in the gaps and complete the previous volumes, so we need not discuss their content further here. At the beginning of my remarks, I claimed that this book constitutes a historic milestone. In order to understand the nature of this milestone, we must examine its place in the development of Hasidism and in the development of the Halakhah. Hasidism brought with it not only a theological message, but also, and maybe primarily, a normative tidings. The Hasidic lifestyle brought with it tens and subsequently perhaps hundreds of new norms, and were eventually referred to as Hasidic Minhagim. These norms originated in Kabbalah, others emerged from the guidance of Tzaddikim, while some are that already existed in popular folklore were given an aura of sanctity by Hasidism, kind of popular minhagim that later on got the title of Hasidic minhagim. How did the leaders of Hasidism view these norms? And by what authority did they believe that they had the license to establish them as customs for their followers? An examination of the writings of leaders of Hasidism from the end of the 18th century until Sperling's time reveals that there was an interesting ideological development on this issue during the period. Reb Shneur Zalman of Ladi and Reb Chaim of Tzanz, Reb Chaim Halberstam of Tzanz, the Divrei Chaim, both of whom were rabbis, admorim poskim, held that Hasidic custom is a voluntary norm that the individual can decide to adopt or not. In the Halachic code of Reb Shneur Zalman Ladi, Shulchan Aruch Harav, there is practically no Kabbalistic or Hasidic influence, and it is based largely on the literature of Halachic authorities, although in Chabad there is a tradition that he retracted this position. Reb Chaim of Tzanz, as well, distinguished between Halakhah and both Kabbalah and Hasidism in his response to questions addressed to him on relevant matters, as he showed in an article. Another Rebbe and Halachic authority, Moshe Teitelbaum of Uyhai, the Yismach Moshe, formulated a somewhat different nuance. Although he too perceived Hasidic customs as voluntary norm, he viewed it as a communal rather than individual choice. In his opinion, a community could take upon itself a system of Hasidic customs, just as any community can adopt any statute. An individual who is a member of the community is obligated to follow these customs, but no one can be coerced to join such a community. Rabbi Teitelbaum expressed these ideas in an interesting correspondence with the Khatam Sofer. correspondence in which Hatam Sofer criticized him over the fact that Hasidim were abandoning the Ashkenazi prayer version, and that had been utilized had been utilized by their ancestors in adopting Nusach Sfarad, as well as the fact that they were adding on an abundance of Kabbalistic stringencies. One generation later, we find the position that establishes Kabbalistic and Hasidic customs as a binding halacha for all Jews. This position was expressed by Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Safrin of Komarno, who even composed a comprehensive halachic work in this spirit entitled Shulchan HaTahor. However, this position did not achieve a standing on the Hasidic street, not just because Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac was considered an unusual and eccentric rabbi, to say the least of it, but also because the book remained unfinished and its manuscript and in manuscript for many decades after his death, the death of Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac. Actually, it was published only in Tel Aviv in the 1960s. This brings us to Sperling. Okay, so we said first generation of rabbis, it's a voluntary norm for the individual. Second generation of rabbis, it's a voluntary norm of the community. Third generation of rabbis, at least one of them, it's halachic norm for all the entirety of Israel. Now comes Sperling. It brings us to Sperling, who also had a successor. In 1901, several years after he began to publish Ta'amei Haminhagim, a second book of Hasidic customs was published in Warsaw, entitled Mishmeret Shalom by Reb Sholem of Koidenov, Sholem Perlov of Brahin. This book presents a much smaller number of customs, but conducts for each of them a much deeper and scholarly discussion than the one Sperling did, including a defense of the customs based on halachic rationales. Both men, neither of whom were rabbis, but both belonging to families of rabbis, present a new approach, that Hasidic customs are simply customs, minhagim. Like minhagim of ethnic groups, locales, and families, so too there are Hasidic minhagim. They are not individual voluntary norms, nor communal voluntary norms, nor halachic obligations. They are all simply customs. This approach is apparently the simplest and most intuitive. If so, why did it take more than 100 years for it to rise in Hasidic literature? It seems to me that the answer is self-evident. A minhag is what one sees practiced by his father and grandfather. As long as Hasidism was a young movement, its customs were not the customs practiced by its adherents' ancestors. On the contrary, the Hasidic customs were a divergence from ancestral minhagim. Their fathers and grandfathers had followed the simple Ashkenazi customs, along with the particular local customs. This one was one of the facts. This was one, in fact, of the most forceful arguments of the Mitnagdim. Level the Geisen Hasidim, that the Hasidim were abandoning the Ashkenazic minhag, including its fixed formula for prayer, and adopting new customs. Hasidic stories tell us about the way that Hasidim dealt with those accusations in the first generations of the movement. Thus, for example, it was told that Reb Nachman of Kosov, a close associate of the Baal Shem Tov, that he arrived one day to the community of Zholkiev, once again, and when he led the prayers, he changed the prayer version from Ashkenaz to Sfarad. When he finished, quote, all of the people in the Bet Midrash shouted at him and said, how do you have the audacity to go to the reader's stand without permission and to change the prayer service to a formulation that our fathers and their fathers, who were all greatest scholars of their generations, did not pray? Reb Nachman responded sharply, and who can say that they now reside in paradise? Needless to say that this answer raised the ire of those who heard him. According to another apparently unconnected version, he said that when people ask why didn't I see this Hasidic practice performed by my father or grandfather, it is appropriate to respond, once again I quote, did your father bring the Messiah? He even preached about this using a play on words by citing the verse, do not turn to the Al tifnu el haovot, do not turn to the ovot, that is sorcerers, to say do not turn to the avot, that is to the fathers. A well-known Hasidic story recounts that Menachem Mendel of Kotsk went to the court of the Seer of Lublin where he adopted Hasidic customs. When his father arrived there and asked him, how could you to be so brazen to abandon the customs of the father, the Kotzker quoted to him the biblical verse, "This is my God, and this is my God, and I will glorify him, the God of my fathers, and I will exalt him," explaining the citations in sheer contradiction to Rashi's interpretation as follows. First it is written, "It is my God, and I will glorify him, and only then the God of my father, and I will exalt him." First mine, then my father. However, when these two books, Ta'amei Haminhagim and Mishmeret Shalom, were written, Hasidism was already matured. In contrast to the early days of the movement, now every Hasid could say about the customs of Hasidism, "This is what I saw from my father and grandfather." And thus it could be well appropriate to command him, okay, so continue the tradition of your fathers, do not divert from it. Certainly there is an additional point. Not only did Hasidism mature, but it also joined the Orthodox struggle against the forces of modernity in the Jewish world. Reform Judaism, the Enlightenment, and the other new movements frequently attacked Jewish customs as burdensome and superfluous practices that could be waived given the fact that they are not based on canonized halachic sources. At this time, the heads of Orthodoxy in Galicia and Hungary mounted an aggressive defense of the Halakhah, including and at times emphasizing the defense of minhagim. The Hasidic leaders in Galicia were at times at the forefront of this struggle, and Sperling's book certainly integrated well into the effort. Thus we find Sperling enthusiastically quoting statements written by the Khatam Sofer against Reform Judaism on the obligatory prohibition of divergence from ancestral customs, even though the same Khatam Sofer wrote similar words to the Ismach Moshe, and they were directed against the customs of the Hasidim, diverging from the Ashkenazi custom. It should be noted that in this regard there is a difference between Sperling and Perlov. Sperling adopted the complete Orthodox approach and argued that just as one is obligated to observe the customs of his ethnic group, his locale, and his family, so too a Hasid is obligated to observe the customs of Hasidic community. Perlov took a position closer to the spirit of early Hasidism, and in a very nice section that Bube would have loved, he explained why, despite the obligation to follow ancestral customs, a person should have his own independent path and diverge from the path of his ancestors when his understanding of the sources differs from theirs. At the same time, it is clear that both books are important works designed to defend the sanctity of Hasidic minhagim. I hope I convinced you that the book Ta'amei Haminhagim represents a milestone in the history of Hasidism, and that it presents a different perspective on custom than that of the previous generations. However, at the beginning of my remarks, I stated that Ta'amei Haminhagim also represents a historic milestone in the history of Halakhah. I will suffice with only a few additional comments on that subject. Minhag is one of the fontes juris, the sources of the law, of traditional Halakhah. For this reason, halachic authorities often rely on public or communal custom in their rulings based on the idea of, quote, go out and see what people are accustomed to do. Yet, in fact, the primary sources of the Halakhah are ultimately the works of halachic literature. Thus, in any event, we should examine on what sources halachic authorities base most of their written works. Here, the question arises, to what degree did non-Hasidim consider a Hasidic custom as a valid halachic source? A brief examination of the Responsa project, Projekt Ashut software, reveals that in a survey of Responsa literature of the 19th century, the phrase Hasidic custom, Minhag Hasidim, appears only 2 times in the writings of non-Hasidic poskim, both from Hungary, by the way. There are, of course, other references, whether they appear in sources not included in this database or using different terminology. Nevertheless, its infrequent occurrence of this phrase does demonstrate something. In contrast, if we now look at the period following the publication of Sperling's book and search for the phrase Ta'amei Haminhagim, the name of his book, here, too, removing findings that do not refer to the name of this specific book, we find many dozens of citations. We also find that the geographic spread of these citations is quite broad, even finding them in the works of halachic authorities like Rav Ovadia Yosef, who as we know, was far removed ideologically from Hasidism and far removed geographically from Galicia. It is noteworthy that Mishmeret Shalom also came up a few times in a similar search, but less than Ta'amei Haminhagim, despite the fact that it is on a higher halakhic scholarly level, as I previously noted. What can you do if Mishmeret Shalom was not commonly given as a bar mitzvah present? We can therefore conclude, committing Hasidic customs to writing, even if the concept of custom was perceived in a broader sense, impacted on several levels. It helped the Hasidim see their customs as valid minhagim in every way, like the customs of ethnic groups and communities that became obligatory normative practices. It facilitated the process of integrating the Hasidim in the defensive array of orthodoxy against modernity, particularly in Hungary and Galicia, where the defense of custom took on great significance. It raised the value of Hasidic custom in general in halachic literature, and it broadened familiarity with Hasidism in the homes that were not particularly Hasidic by the way of bar mitzvah gifts. And it even turned these customs to a large degree into a valid source of Halakhah that can at times be relied upon. This process began with this book, the book of the man who was neither a rabbi nor a rebbe, but just a regular shochet from Lvov, Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak Sperling. Thank you.
Thank you. I have to say that I don't have a question, I have comment. That this book was punctuated into the scholarship, also contemporary scholarship, because at least I can mention two. Avram Holtz, in his edition to Achnasat Kala, used a lot in Sperling's book, and also אני הקוטן, כמו שאומרים, in my edition of the memoirs of Cheskel Kotik, I used the book dozens of times to explain and to understand several practices and customs that mentioned by Kotik. So it's also interesting. If there are, please do it, Char, because the time is running. Michael.
Was Aaron Verheim's book on Hasidic minhagim in any way? How does it interact with this?
It came much later, of course, to rise.
Of course.
Rise on the minhagim just in any other
The 50s.
It's much more scholarly, even half academic in some sense, compared to the minhagim, which is really a kind of folklore.
You didn't get it for a bar mitzvah present.